Anyone who has spent time in remote bushland knows that with its towering trees and deep shadows, at times it can feel unsettling, especially when the silence is broken by the rustle of an unseen creature or the distant echo of an unknown sound. The vast, untamed wilderness has a way of making you feel small and vulnerable, as if nature itself is watching. While at times the solitude can be daunting, for most it's what draws us into these uninhabited places, the beauty of a world untouched by human hands. In the heart of the wilderness, there is no walls to protect you, no streetlights to guide you. It's not the howling of the wind or the darkened paths that haunt your thoughts. It's the knowledge that hidden within these isolated places, the greatest threat may not come from the wild, but from another human, whose darkness is deeper than the shadows that surround you. The team at If These Trees Could Talk wish to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Wonnangatta Nation. We would like to recognise that we share our stories from the stolen lands of our nation's first storytellers. Our conversations in many ways follow their traditions of storytelling and sharing knowledge and experience. We wish to pay our respect to the Wonnarua elders and ancestors, as well as extend that respect to all First Nations people, including our listeners, and acknowledge and honour their continued connections to the land and waters that have been the inspiration for the stories that we share.
We would like to acknowledge all of the lands across which this recording is being broadcast, especially the lands of the Gunai Kurnai and Tunarung people from where today's story takes place.
The Wonnangatta Valley has earned a reputation as a place where people go and sometimes disappear without a trace. It was a fanciful and fictional series of misfortunate events that Gregory Lynn had had months to rehearse. They really don't understand because there is no witness and there is no evidence. If it is true, if he is 100% telling the truth, the fact that he did what he did means he should be in jail for the rest of his life. Megan suggested a bit of a love story this week because we recorded a pretty heavy 2-part episode on an Australian cult called The Family and some of the really shitty stuff that took place throughout that time. And because I always do what I'm told, I put together a really exceptional love story for her, but that's going to have to wait for next episode. I'm sorry, Megan.
Oh.
This episode does have an element of a love story, but I don't think it's the angle that you are aiming for, Megan, so I'm sorry about that.
So the cult story, we've decided to push back a little bit.
Yeah, this is a story that I've really wanted to tell for a long time, and I planned it quite a long time ago, but because there has been a trial associated with it, and unfortunately I don't have access to Hedley Thomas's legal team, I figured it was best just to let it sit for a little while until that trial wrapped up and I could be confident in the stuff that we were sharing was not going to impact the trial or the families of the victims. Just before we start today's episode, I just want to let you know that this again is probably not one to listen to with the kiddos around. We've got a bit of a true crime feel today, and there's some grisly parts that small ears probably don't need to hear. So just letting you know that that's on its way, and if you're not feeling up for it, we'll catch you next time. Today we are headed to the rugged wilderness of Victoria's high country. The Wonnangatta Valley is a land shrouded in legend and intrigue. For over a century, this remote valley has been the backdrop for some of the most perplexing mysteries in Australian history. From the unsolved murder of pioneer James Barclay in 1918 to the mysterious disappearances of David Prudhoe, Conrad Whitlock, Warren Meyer and Niels Becker that remain unsolved and have haunted the area ever since. The Wonnangatta Valley has earned a reputation as a place where people go and sometimes disappear without a trace. And with this, and I know that I've mentioned this to you before, there is also the legend of the Button Man, who the media is quite desperate to attach to some of these disappearances, but in my opinion, he's just a total legend. A very realistic one, not a mythical one, and he deserves his own episode, so we will come back to him at a future date.
I can't wait to hear about the Button Man. You've been dangling this carrot in front of me for a while now.
I have, and it's a hard story to tell because it's all off personal account. He's a real man that goes out and spends lots of time in that valley, but I don't want to give too much away.
No. Shannon, we talked about perhaps having a button to encourage you to move on. Move on.
I think our listeners are getting a pretty good idea of who I am by now, so it won't really be a surprise that the Wonnangatta was high on my list of places to visit. The Wonnangatta Valley is a remote and isolated area nestled amongst the rugged and vast wilderness of the Alpine National Park. It's located 350 kilometres northeast of Melbourne, and due to the difficult access to the area, it takes almost 7 hours to drive into the valley from the city. It's only accessible by skilled four-wheel drivers, hikers and people who are equipped to manage the remoteness of the area. To give you a little bit of context, Megan, it takes about the same amount of time to drive from Melbourne to Canberra as it does to drive from the city down into this valley, which is about half the distance.
So is this where Mount Hotham and Falls Creek are?
No, a little bit away from there, but not too far. You'll be able to make a great virtual tour on this, although I don't know if people will actually want to visit any of these places, so we'll do it anyway. Popular activities for visitors in this area range from four-wheel driving, hiking, skiing, fishing, deer hunting, bird watching and horse riding, to heritage appreciation with an incredibly rich grazing and gold rush history. Visitors to the area need to be fully self-sufficient as food, fuel and phone service can be many hours drive away. And because we love introducing Megan to new critters and we want to give us something to take some joy out of this episode.
Yetis!
Well, quite possibly. And I did wonder that when all these people went missing, whether they had something to do with it. But I'm not going to introduce you to a Yeti. I'm going to introduce you to the mountain pygmy possum.
Ooh.
It is the only marsupial in the world known to store food and hibernate for extended periods. It is also the only Australian mammal adapted to live exclusively in the alpine zones. Do you want to Google it? Because it's really cute.
I do. It is cute. You're going to put a picture of that in the show notes, Shannon, so
I
everyone
will.
can find that. Oh, baby ones.
He's just really tiny.
He is, yeah.
He's just the cutest one. I think they make little tunnels under the snow so they can travel around. They're very cool little critters. So there's been a really excellent podcast called The Missing Campers Trial that has helped me understand the court proceedings. While I like to think that I'm Erin Brockovich because I did do legal studies in Year 12, I am not in any way capable of being able to grasp the really complex legal stuff that has gone on in here. So this podcast was amazing. It's by Erin Pearson, who is the crime and justice reporter for The Age, as well as 9 News reporter Penelope Lish. And they have done an incredible job of making what has sometimes been a very complex and confusing trial and the information surrounding it really accessible, which this trial has a huge amount of public interest. I think with the missing people prior to this and then these 2 additional people, there was a huge amount of interest in the disappearance and in the proceedings since what we're going to go into next has all occurred. So if you are interested in the intricacies, I suggest their podcast as your next stop, where they break down each day of the trial into separate episodes. On March 19th, 2020, just before the world went completely insane with the pandemic, 72-year-old Russell Hill and his wife Robin were packing Russell's bags and his Toyota Land Cruiser for him to set off on a solo camping trip into the Wonnangatta Valley. Russell had maintained a lifelong passion with the outdoors and had spent a lot of time in the valley as one of his favourite camping spots. In his earlier years with the Forestry Service, he had been a part of cutting roads down into this valley, and there's only a few roads down in there, so I believe it was quite a difficult job to get these roads down into. It's quite steep, mountainous terrain around where the valley lies. Russell had since retired and was enjoying his hobbies. He had been a long-time member of an amateur radio club and had made a lot of good friends within that space. The group chatted with each other most nights, and his skills in that area made it possible for him to stay in contact with his friends while he was away on trips such as the one he was taking. Most of these places have no phone reception, so being able to access communication with people was a great way. He was 72. It was great for him to be able to let people know that he was safe. Russell had also recently purchased a drone that he enjoyed learning how to fly and film with his brand new toy and was looking forward to using it on this trip. On the evening of March 20, he used his radio to check in at about 6 p.m. and let the group know that he arrived and that he was safe. On March 18th, another camper, 53-year-old hunter and Jetstar pilot Gregory Lynn, had arrived in the Wonnangatta Valley and on the 20th set up at Bucks Camp for a hunting trip. Gregory had left his wife Melanie and their children at home, and he was camping alone, set up alongside his Nissan Patrol with his rifle and a shotgun in the hope of nabbing himself a deer during the stay. He wasn't successful in shooting a deer on that trip and returned home on March 22nd, just as the news of COVID lockdowns were hitting the media, which proved to be a welcome distraction from what had occurred on his trip. On the 21st of March, Andrew Marcourt was visiting the valley with his family, and as they rolled into Bucks Camp, they came across an unusual scene. There was a burnt campsite and a charred vehicle alone in the campground with no one in the area. Obviously, with his family in tow, they chose to look elsewhere for somewhere to camp. This strange scene obviously played on his mind as he found a new campground and set up with his family, and he decided to check back the next day just to see if anyone was around, because it certainly didn't make sense to him. When he returned back, he photographed the site. He looked around and documented the burnt tent and all of the belongings. However, there was an esky full of food and ice that seemed untouched. When he looked into the singed car, he could see a handbag sitting on the seat. This seemed very unusual, so he decided that he would report his findings to police as soon as he made it out of the valley. That same evening, Robin Hill switched on the radio in the hope of hearing her husband check in with his friends. However, that evening she did not hear her husband's voice amongst the radio chatter. Over the next few nights, she did the same thing, but there were no check-ins from Russell, and this had her a little bit concerned. Robin called her daughter to mention she had heard nothing from her father, and she suggested that she should probably report it to the police. Just after she made this call, one of Russell's friends from the radio group called Robin, as he was also concerned that he hadn't heard anything from Russell either. It was unusual for Russell to miss even one night of communication with his radio friends, but at this point it had been 3 days since anyone had heard from him, so the decision was made to alert the police. The concern from the Hill family, along with the reports and the photographs of the burnt-out campsite that the Marcourts had discovered at Bucks Camp, was the beginning of what would be an 18-month-long police investigation. When the police made it to the site, they found it just as the Marcourts had described. As they began their investigation, they found the burnt remains of a whole campsite of equipment, along with a car registered to Russell Hill. Inside that vehicle, they found Russell's wallet, as well as a lady's handbag with identification for a woman by the name of Carol Clay. Do you want to ask any questions?
So we're going to have a timeline for this one?
Yes, I have already started putting a timeline together because the way that I've written this episode, these things happened not simultaneously. So I've tried to put it in a chronological order time-wise because some of the information we knew early at the beginning and lots of reports and media articles and stuff come out about that at the time. And then there are parts of this that we've learnt since the trial has taken place. So I've tried to piece the bits together that I can to give you a nice straight line story.
I appreciate that.
You know, there's little bits that I've kind of plucked out to try and put it together. But once we get sort of down to what had occurred at that campsite, I try and do it in a very chronological order. But I will still put a timeline together so you can see what happened on what day because it's a little bit confusing.
And this is our first recent story, new history.
Yeah, and our first true crimey one too. On March 29th, police contacted Carol's daughter Emma to inquire about the whereabouts of her mum. Police at this stage had received no calls in concern for her safety. Although Emma had been trying to contact her mum with no luck for a couple of days, she, at this stage, had not been overly concerned. Carol had a very busy and fulfilling life as an active member of her community. She was an active member of the Red Cross and had served as the president of her local CWA. And just a little side note for the non-Australian listeners, because we have a few, which is really exciting. The CWA is an organisation here in Australia which seeks to advance the interests of women, families and communities, especially in rural, regional and remote areas. It's also widely known that they make the best cakes and scones. And if you're ever like at a little community fundraiser or something and the CWA has a stall, that is where you're going to spend your money. So when police contacted Carol's daughter Emma and inquired about the likelihood that their mum may have been in the Wonnangatta Valley with Russell Hill, this did not come as a surprise. Russell and Carol had known each other since their teens. In fact, they had been childhood sweethearts and each other's first loves. But like many young romances, they had gone their separate ways and both started lives, married other people and had their own respective families. However, in 2006, their paths crossed again and their romance rekindled. They spent over a decade hiding this relationship from their partners, but it wasn't, in all honesty, completely hidden. Russell had initially introduced Carol to his wife Robin as his cousin. So Carol was not a stranger to the Hill family. The time did come when they chose that they would leave their partners to be together, and Carol did divorce her husband. However, Russell backed out, stating that Robin was unwell and he was concerned for her if he was to leave, how she would cope at that time. The affair did eventually come out, but Robin stood by Russell under the assumption that the relationship with Carol had ended. However, this was not the case. And it was not uncommon for Carol to join Russell on some of these camping trips. Those close to Carol were aware of the ongoing nature of her relationship with Russell, so it was no great shock to her daughter to hear that they may have been together up in the valley. However, once they became missing persons, Carol's family was quite concerned about the impact for Robin, especially to learn that not only was her husband missing, but that Carol had also been with him at that time.
So she was still unwell?
I think she was doing okay, and I don't know exactly if maybe that was an excuse Russell made. I don't know about the full intricacies of that. It was very obvious that Russell and Carol were really quite in love with each other. And after this happened, lots of people came out and said, yes, we knew, or it was very obvious. And even Robin herself said that because the families, like when Carol was still married, Carol and her husband and Russell and Robin would like go away together on group weekends and stuff. And she said the dynamic between them was sometimes she questioned it because it seemed a little bit more like they weren't cousins, but they really enjoyed each other's company. And she said they would often like sort of go off on walks alone and stuff. So some small red flags, but Robin really loved her husband. And when he said to her that, no, this relationship is over, she believed him and stuck by him. So props to Robin for that. As the time passed to the public, it didn't seem that there was much movement in the case. However, behind the scenes, the police were working diligently on the very few leads that they had. Both Carol and Russell's phones had pinged a tower as they headed into the park, but then had gone offline, which is not unusual. That's what would happen to anyone's phone in that area. 3 days later, though, Russell Hill's mobile pinged on a tower at Hotham Heights, a significant distance from Buck's camp where they had been staying. It was the last record of his phone ever being active, but it gave the police somewhere to start looking. Police began to link Greg Lynn to the case when an automatic number plate recognition camera near Mount Hotham, typically used to catch people trying to avoid to pay park entry fees to the ski resort, picked up his dark blue Nissan Patrol with a trailer travelling through the area very close to the time that Russell's phone pinged that tower, which was close by. On July 14th, 2020, almost 4 months after Carol and Russell's disappearance, the police knocked on Greg Lynn's door, introducing themselves and advising that they were looking for witnesses in the case. Greg told them that he had not come across the couple in his travels and offered information about his movements that the police would later find out were fabricated. But as they were leaving the property, they noticed a Nissan Patrol that matched the number plate that was picked up on that surveillance camera. However, it was no longer dark blue. It was now a sandy beige colour. This information, along with their suspicion that Gregory Lynn had had some sort of involvement in these disappearances, was enough for the police to obtain a warrant to install listening devices in Greg's home, car and phone, as well as cameras in his driveway. For months, the police were listening into conversations that he was having with others, as well as the ones that he was having with himself. And in November, they set a trap for him. 60 Minutes aired a special where they shared the information that had previously been concealed from the public, including an image from the surveillance cameras of the Nissan Patrol that showed the car, trailer and a distinctive retractable awning on the roof of the vehicle. That awning was still on Gregory's car when the police had sighted it the first day that they had knocked on his door. Greg and his wife Melanie were watching the special together at home when the pictures were revealed of that vehicle. Melanie questioned Greg immediately and Greg responded, "Don't even suggest that." But the very next day, the cameras that the police had installed in the driveway captured Greg removing the awning from his car.
So many questions. Technology is incredible. From knowing, where the tower last pinged your phone to bugging a house. How do you do that? How do you get into somebody's house and bug it?
I wondered the same thing. I have no idea.
Could somebody be bugging my house right now?
Well, possibly. I think it's just best to assume that you're always on camera somewhere. I don't know how they would get it into a house, and I'm not sure that's probably information that the police would share.
Fascinating though.
Amazing.
A little scary.
I'm thinking about them, like sneaking up the driveway at night and like putting the little cameras and stuff.
Yeah, and their little stakeout van out the back down the street.
I'm not
donuts.
You're the tech person, Megan. I think that you would know. I don't.
Well, they would have to be in the house.
Oh, they would have to be in there.
Yeah.
The police would have to. Yeah, they'd have to get into the house, but I'm not sure that white vans, like Home Alone.
My head, that's what happens. Probably not necessary these days.
I think it might be a little bit more tech savvy than that now, but still incredible that they were able to do that, and even setting that up, holding that information back from the public and releasing that just through a 60 Minutes episode. Like, there was huge amounts of interest in this case. So it was not unusual that 60 Minutes would run a special on this, but the police setting it up so that previously withheld information was then released once they had those things in Greg's house, so they could see his reaction to watching that and seeing his car on TV. Very clever. Police are amazing. Less than 2 weeks later, Greg left for another solo camping trip to the Wonnangatta Valley. During the trip, the hidden recording equipment caught him talking to himself in his car, saying things like how his wife would be left to care for the kids alone and that a snake bite might not be such a bad way to go out. This obviously rang alarm bells with police who were listening in as an indicator that he may be planning on taking his own life. So they jumped to action. In a dramatic series of events, they got a pile of police officers, heavily armed, into a helicopter and they took off towards where Greg Lynn was camping. The helicopter comes down, the police all jump out and he is arrested at that campsite and taken back to Sale Police Station for questioning. He initially just is, in the interviews with the police, is just no comment, no comment, no comment, and that's obviously what his legal team advised. But after 45 hours in custody, Gregory Lynn decided to share his version of the events that unfolded on the 20th of March 2020. Greg Lynn had told police that he had arrived and set up on the 19th, somewhere before Russell and Carol had arrived. Later the following evening, an altercation occurred. While he was returning from hunting back towards the camp, he heard a noise that sounded like buzzing. He initially thought that he might have disturbed like a bee's nest or something, and so he was kind of looking around as he was walking, not really understanding where this sound was coming from, and then looked up and noticed that there was a drone flying overhead, seemingly keeping tabs on him. So it wasn't just sort of flying over and, surveying the landscape. It kind of was following his movements, according to him.
Mm-hmm.
So when he returned to the campsite, a heated exchange occurred. According to Greg, he confronted Russell about the drone after noticing that he had the controller in his hand as he walked past his camp. He said that Russell accused him of hunting too close to camp and that he had recorded drone footage to prove it and would take the footage to authorities. Greg said that this angered him as he was adhering to the hunting rules and prided himself on being an ethical hunter. He said he was caught off guard as prior to this their interactions had been quite positive. Greg said he returned to his camp feeling quite annoyed and started prepping his dinner. With this playing over in his mind as he was kind of setting his fire and getting his food out ready to cook, he decided that he would antagonise his neighbours. Greg opened the door to his vehicle, turned on his stereo in an attempt to piss off Russell and Carol. Greg said he was sitting by the fire and it was just coming on dark when he noticed some movement near his truck. He got up to investigate and saw Russell heading back towards his campsite with Greg's shotgun under his arm. Infuriated, he followed Russell back towards his campsite, yelling at him about taking his gun. Greg said that Russell spun around, cocked the gun and fired a couple of rounds into the air, yelling at Greg to fuck off. Greg said that when the shots were fired, he darted around the back of Russell's truck, so this is close to his campsite, fearing for his life. He said he heard Russell cock the shotgun again and then heard his footsteps coming closer towards him. Greg said he then saw the barrel of the gun come across the bonnet of the car, pointing towards where he was ducked down and hiding. He then made the choice to try and disarm Russell, and a struggle for the firearm followed. Gregory said he spun Russell around and pushed his back against the bull bar, and then suddenly a shot rings out. The bullet fires through the side mirror of the vehicle and hits Carol directly in the head, killing her instantly. He said in the shock he was able to snatch the gun from Russell, and then he headed back towards his campsite, firing off more shots on the way to empty the gun of ammunition before placing it back in his car. As he was doing this, he said that Russell is following him yelling, "She's dead, she's dead." By this stage he said it was dark and he turned around, but he could see the glint of a metal blade of a knife in Russell's hand. He said that he managed to block Russell's initial attempt to stab him with the knife and another struggle ensued. He recounts the details of this struggle and his attempt to subdue Russell with punches being thrown and Russell taking swipes at him with the knife. During the altercation, they fall to the ground And he says that when he is able to get up and back onto his feet, he noticed Russell is still on the ground. He said that as he backs away from Russell, who was trying to crawl towards him at this stage, but he then stopped moving entirely. Greg said he tried to survey the situation, and when he got a little bit closer, he noticed that Russell had fallen onto the knife, which had plunged deep into his chest. Greg said that he then checked Russell and found no pulse, and he immediately went to Carol, who was clearly deceased from a bullet wound to the head.
You're looking at me like I've got questions. I've got so many questions, but I feel like you're going to answer them.
I don't know. We'll see. There is a lot of information in this case, and I tried to condense it into a 40-minute episode for you, Megan.
Yep.
So
How's that going for you?
I don't know. What are we up to? Now, I just want to remind everybody here that it's very important to remember that this is Greg Lynn's account of the events that occurred.
The only witness that is still alive.
The only witness. The prosecution would go on to say at the trial that it was a fanciful and fictional series of misfortunate events that Gregory Lynn had had months to rehearse. The defence, however, put Gregory on the stand as their only witness, where he recounted this information in a calm and methodical manner. The only thing that the defence and the prosecution could agree on was Gregory's account of what came next on the night and in the months following. With 2 dead bodies on his hands, Gregory weighed up his options. He himself will attest during questioning, as well as on the stand in the trial, to the poor decision-making that followed. He had 2 options. The first was to report what had just taken place, or the second was to cover it up. And unfortunately, he chose the latter. He says that he was in a moment of panic. His career and future was at stake, and so choices were made.
His career was, he's a pilot?
He is a pilot, yes. So he works for Jetstar. I really grapple with this. He talks a lot during the trial about how he's trained to, in stressful situations, make really calm, methodical decisions. While that kind of worked for the defence, like they were like, yes, he just made a series of choices because he was in a panicked situation, the prosecution really had a field day with that whole thing and pushed him and pushed him and pushed him to the point that he almost cracked. It's very, very interesting listening to that play out in court.
When you think of people who murder people, you're not thinking of people with a job like a pilot.
No, and when you listen to this man talk, and you can, like his police interviews are online now, he is articulate and well-spoken and so calm, emotionless. He seems clear and methodical in the way that he explains what takes place.
I don't know. And we probably won't ever know, will we, actually what conversation, like what has led this man to do this?
No, because he's the only witness, and what I've just read is the only account of what happened on that day.
Right, and it goes to jury.
It goes to the jury. Basically, in the trial, the prosecution is saying, no, that's not what happened. This man, something happened, and I think a big part, because the burden of proof lies with the prosecution, so they are the people who are responsible for proving beyond reasonable doubt. And the reasonable doubt thing is the thing here. Like, as a juror, you've only got one witness.
Is there more evidence, like fingerprints or what way the knife went in, or?
Okay, I want you to ask me that question again after I read you this next part, because what we've just talked about is just a very, very small part of this whole picture.
Okay.
Going back to Greg, he said that he was in a moment of panic for everything laid out in front of him, his career, his future, his kids, his livelihood, his income. He felt that the police would not believe his version of events. The prosecution would argue later in court that the evidence at the scene would have been the one thing that would have supported his version of events. and that the fact that he destroyed every shred of evidence proved that what occurred on that night at Buck's camp was not a series of accidents, but a man who killed 2 people with murderous intent.
Mm-hmm.
Gregory Lynn told police with an emotional calmness about the events that took place following the deaths of Russell Hill and Carol Clay. Lynn explained that it took him only seconds to weigh up the potential consequences of coming forward to the police. He believed that doing so would ruin his career and place his family in financial jeopardy. This is his words. "So yes, I tried to save myself," he admitted. Lynn recounted that he placed the bodies in the back of his trailer. He cleaned the blood at the scene, and then he gathered up all of the equipment around Russell and Carol's campsite, placed it inside of their tent, and set it on fire to eliminate any remaining evidence. He then drove through the night searching for a place to dispose of their bodies. Greg burned the clothes he wore at the campsite, thoroughly cleaning his guns upon returning home, and promptly sold the trailer he used to transport the bodies. "I started to get nervous that the plan was falling apart, and then you knocked on my door," he later told investigators. Although Greg had disposed of the campsite evidence, he was aware that there was still something in the bush that could incriminate him. With the city facing further lockdowns and travel restrictions, he had no choice but to wait. 7 months after the campers' deaths, Lynn made another trip into Victoria's remote high country. This time he returned to Union Spur Track, where he had left the bodies of Mr. Hill and Mrs. Clay under a pile of sticks and leaves. They were decomposing, he later told police. Lynn placed additional logs and kerosene on the bodies and lit a match. He sat by that fire, stoking it, all night until only tiny bone fragments remained. "I just used a dustpan to scoop it up and scatter it around. There is literally nothing left," he said. Oh, your face.
So nothing. They really did find nothing.
Well, they did. They found about 2,000 tiny pieces of bone fragments, as well as a little part of Carol's ring and a piece of Russell's watch, which Gregory Lynn had scooped up in a dustpan and placed into the root ball of a fallen tree.
I'm starting to develop a bit more of an image of this person in my head now.
Yeah.
Not good.
Put that man in charge of a plane.
Did they put Greg's family on the stand? Do we have any accounts of his character or...
So the defence chose not to have any character witnesses. Greg was the only person that they put on the stand.
What do you think that means?
I think it means a lot of things, like perhaps maybe no one liked him. Some people that he worked with at Jetstar came forward and said that some of the junior pilots would actually call in sick if they were rostered to work with him. There's some more stuff that I'm going to get into a little bit later where there was some stuff that was ruled inadmissible in pre-trial that I think would have made a massive difference. But obviously our legal system is designed for justice, so judges have to adhere to the fact that the person on the stand is presumed innocent until proven guilty. So they make choices about things, but we'll get into a little bit more of that in a second. Greg's trial ran for 5 weeks, where he pleaded not guilty to the murder of Russell Hill and Carol Clay. It concluded on the 25th of June, where the jury handed down a surprising split verdict of not guilty for the murder of Russell Hill, but guilty for the murder of Carol Clay. His sentencing date is set for September, and it appears that the defence team is planning to appeal this conviction. There have been reports that Gregory has been attacked in prison and has been moved into protection. There was a lot of important information, as we just mentioned, that was not permitted to be put in front of the jury. The following was reported by ABC News. It paints a bit of a different picture to the calm and methodical man that the jury saw on the stand. In March 2021, after hearing a radio news story about Mr. Hill and Mrs. Clay, Lynn was recorded saying, "They're sitting on a nudist beach in fucking Queensland. Butt naked, playing on his fucking drone, running it up and down the beach, taking pictures of all the young people. Who's got the biggest dick?" He was just muttering that to himself. An audio recording captured Gregory's wife bursting into high-pitched hysterical laughter while watching the 60 Minutes episode. "It looks like your car, it really does," she exclaimed. "That's not funny, sweet pea," Lynn replied. Prosecutors wanted to play this recording to show the jury further evidence of Lynn's cover-up, but Justice Croucher ruled it out. So in Gregory's police interview, when he was interviewed at Sale Police Station, he said that he had never discussed this with anyone, that his wife had no idea, and because of the impending lockdown when he arrived back from that trip, she was completely preoccupied and had no idea of what had occurred. So going back to that, the prosecutors wanted to play the recording, but Justice Croucher ruled it out. "She's cackling like a hyena, it might be said," the judge remarked. Melanie Lynn, who was sitting in the court's public gallery as the recording was played, began sobbing as she heard a voice echoing through the room. In an earlier ruling, Justice Croucher said Ms. Lynn was also captured saying other things during the recording in the 60 Minutes story. Miss Lynn joked about Mr. Lynn having to hide things now, and how Mrs. Clay did not like camping and how she got donked on the head after someone got mad with her, the judge wrote. Greg Lynn later told police he kept the camper's death a secret from his wife and that she had no knowledge of his involvement before his arrest. However, these recordings may provide speculation to that claim. The jury was also not told about the overdose death of Lynn's former wife 25 years ago, or the abusive relationship that she was in with Mr. Lynn. In the pre-trial hearing for the deaths of Russell and Carol, Gregory Lynn's defence considered presenting evidence of his good character. However, prosecutors intended to counter this with statements from Lynn's late wife's family, who alleged she lived in fear of him. Ultimately, both sides agreed not to include this in the trial. Miss Lynn's mother claimed that her daughter suffered regular physical and mental abuse from Mr. Lynn, describing his behaviour as violent and bizarre. She recalled incidents where Lynn lost his temper, blamed Lisa for everything, and even harmed animals. She also mentioned that her daughter kept a diary documenting abusive threats from Lynn, which left her terrified. Lynn's defence criticised these claims as unproven allegations.
Why are they not presenting all of the information at court?
I think for the defence, they struggled to be able to get a group of people outside of Gregory Lynn's family to be able to testify to his good character. What also happens is once you put a witness on a stand, they are allowed to be cross-examined. So if there's even a crack in the statement that they're going to make, it can be torn apart by the person doing the cross-examination. What a pre-trial hearing is for is to put all the evidence forward, and then the judge says, yes, this adheres to the law, this doesn't, this can be included, this doesn't. But it also allows the defence and prosecution to kind of develop a strategy. They know what each other have got in their pocket and how they're going to structure that. One might give a little, one might, take a hit there, but that might mean that they might get a little somewhere else. And, it's a very, very complex and full-on law system. So this is why I found that podcast, The Missing Campers Trial, so helpful, because not only did the girls break it down day by day in the trial, so you knew exactly what was being presented and who it was being presented by and which people were acting for the prosecution and which people were acting for the defence. But then they would also talk about the legal process behind it and why certain things would happen in certain ways, which really made a big difference to me being able to sort of take in the information and understand why it had occurred the way that it did.
Cool job.
Amazing job. I would love to be a court reporter. I have desperately wanted to be on a jury and I've never been picked.
Same. Everyone whinges about jury duty.
I want to go
Me
so
too.
bad. I find it fascinating. It's sad, and it would be really hard if you were in a trial like this or something that involved
Emotional.
kids. Or
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
it would be so taxing, but I think it would be amazing to sit inside of a jury room and understand what goes on.
Yeah. Well, while we're on that, why do you think that the decision was not unanimous?
I don't know. I think it was a surprise for everybody, and I don't think they quite understand how that occurred. I know that the judge said just prior to the jury going off to deliberate that manslaughter was off the table. It was murder or it was nothing. So the prosecution really pushed that they believe Russell was murdered first and that Carol was then killed because she was a witness to the murder of Russell. But they don't have a motive. They don't understand. They don't know whether it was a fight over a drone. They don't know whether Gregory Lynn is just a murderous asshole and shot everyone inside. They really don't understand because there is no witness and there is no evidence. I don't know if it's because that's the way that it was presented and then Gregory Lynn's defence was the opposite and, they were both accidents and that kind of thing.
What was their reason for why he wasn't guilty for Russell?
So we don't ever know, and the jury is not required to give a reason why. They just come in and there will be an elected spokesperson for the jury and they will hand a piece of paper to the judge and it will say, we find Gregory Lynn not guilty of the murder of Russell Hill and guilty of the murder of Carol Clay. And they're not required. And we have really specific laws in Australia around protecting jurors and their identities so they can't be hounded in the media like in America and stuff. That happens all the time, and media people will go after jurors to try and get the inside story of what's going on there. We have really, really strict laws in Australia that forbid that kind of stuff from happening. So we may never, ever know why it occurred that way. I am wondering if it's falling back onto the principle of beyond reasonable doubt. So because the prosecution said Russell was killed first and Carol was killed second and she was killed because she was a witness to a crime, maybe they believe that beyond reasonable doubt.
Right.
But and they had a motive for that because she was a witness.
Yeah.
So all of they have a checklist and they were able to tick off all of those things. They have that same checklist for Russell and maybe they weren't able to tick all of the boxes because you would assume in a case like this, you either believe the prosecution or you believe Gregory Lynn's version of events. I know that the jury came back before they delivered the verdict and asked the judge some questions, and one of those questions were, are we able to provide a split verdict? He obviously said yes, and here we are.
Is there a consequence for the other things he did, like hide bodies and cut them up? And
yeah, this is where I really struggle with
Is there no consequence for that?
What happens when a case is put before the DPP and they decide what amount of evidence they have and what charge they should go for? Now, in somewhere where it might be a bit tricky, they might offer a deal and say, well, we will reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter because they feel more confident that they might be able to achieve that outcome with the evidence that they have. But that also has to be accepted by the defence. In this case, I think that the prosecution felt very sure that what had occurred here was a double murder, and they went after that charge to try and get the maximum penalty. I don't know if they had put forward a lesser option before and it had been rejected because the defence was like, well, no, aim for the top because then we're more likely to be able to, put some doubt into the jurors' minds. I don't 100% understand it. This is just my loose grasp of what's occurred. But again, If you want to know, this podcast, the Missing Campus Trial, so good. And they go right into it. They have legal experts who really cover all of this stuff. So if you've got the same questions that Megan has, I suggest that you jump over there.
I have another question.
Yes?
Do you or anyone else from your research have the question that this might be related to the other missing people?
I have thought that, yes. I don't know. He was an expert bushman. He spent a lot of time hunting. Is it possible? Yeah, it could be. There's some other stuff that I haven't gone into here because, like I said, there's a lot of suppression orders. And I've heard it reported in a couple of places, but I haven't been able to verify the information in regards to some of the stuff that Gregory Lynn had done. There's an account with a neighbour, and there's also a really horrible thing that occurred. And so some articles will just say there's stuff that hasn't been printed. Some other articles go right into it. A lot of those articles are behind paywalls, but it is out there. And if you want to know that stuff, it won't take you much Googling or listening to be able to find that stuff. But my research for this episode has not come from the Daily Mail. Like, I've tried to go to reputable websites for this stuff because it gets sensationalized and blown out of proportion, and the public interest in this. And there's, the affair with Carol and Russell, the whole thing is so clickbaity. You want to be taking this stuff from the actual real information, because while it seems so remote and out of this world, this actually occurred and 2 people died. I just want to acknowledge Russell and Carol's families, because I can't imagine the harrowing experience of sitting through 5 weeks of this toing and froing between prosecution and defence, arguing these different points, let alone having to sit in the same room as Gregory Lynn while he recounted sitting by a fire and burning the bodies of their family members. I just got like goosebumps down my whole body. I can't for the life of me fathom how you could sit in that room and remain composed while listening to him tell that story. In a way of, poor me, I was so panicked and I didn't know what to do and my life was on the line. Their kids didn't get to bury their parents. Robin didn't get to say goodbye to the man that she stood by for her whole life. Like, that part of it itself, I just feel like that should carry a full life sentence. The fact that he did what he did and he has admitted to doing that, he should never be able to walk out in society again just for that alone. Even if it played out exactly the way that it did and it was all an accident and 2 people just happened to end up dead in the campsite next to him. If it is true, if he is 100% telling the truth, the fact that he did what he did means he should be in jail for the rest of his life.
And at time of recording, there's no sentence as of yet?
No. So sentencing will take place in September, early September, but from the end of the trial, I think that the defence has got 28 days to lodge an appeal, which I believe has happened. There's been some talk about the prosecution breaking rules by the way that they did things, little syntaxy things that they do in these legal scenarios to try and, get appeals and stuff. So, this is the end of this part of the story about the trial, but this is certainly not over. We don't know what's going to happen to Greg Lynn. We don't know if this trial is going to be able to be appealed. I'll keep watching on to see how it all plays out, but for now, we just don't know what the end outcome is going to be.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of If These Trees Could Talk. If you would like to access more about the places or information included in today's topic, please visit our website, ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. If you would like to follow us on our adventures, check us out on Facebook or Insta. Our creative writer is Shannon Walters, and our podcast is produced at Bellevue Studio in the Hunter Valley with audio production by Megan Anderson. We love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review, and if you would like to hear more, please subscribe. We look forward to you joining us for our next adventure.